This is Janice Lopez from the International Organization for Migration, and welcome to the Migration Health Research Podcast. For the current edition of the Migration Health Research Bulletin, issue number 15, we feature IM reports from Solomon Islands in Georgia. We also profile an article discussing how migrant stocks seem to differ depending on what regional or economic criterion of the term development is used. We also included articles centering on the health status and safety of international migrant workers. Also, we present a study that looks at the nutrition profile of Syrian refugee children before resettlement, as well as studies focusing on the mental health and well-being of migrants. For this podcast episode, we are pleased to feature two studies. Professor David Ingleby, a researcher at the Center for Social Science and Global Health at the University of Amsterdam, will speak about their study on the factors that affect migrant stocks in developing countries and why it appears increasing or decreasing depending on these factors. The study was done in collaboration with IOM and the University of Bristol. Also, Ms. Angelica Neville, IOM project manager based in Solomon Islands, will talk about their report on the health issues, risks, and vulnerabilities associated with heightened mobility in Solomon Islands. Let's listen to Professor David Ingleby.
What we really wanted was to get a more accurate picture of how development is related to the volume of migration. In particular, there's a lot of talk these days about how migration is booming in the global south. An increasing number of migrants are choosing not the global north, but the global south as their destination. And most of them come from the south, so we see an increase in south-to-south migration. And we wanted to check if this was really happening because we were not really confident about the way in which countries are being classified as north or south. You see, it's usually done using UNDESA's distinction between the more developed and the less developed regions, which everybody probably knows. But if you think about it, it's a very strange criterion because it defines countries' level of developments in terms of where they are. And that really means it can never change because countries can't get up and move somewhere else. And yet development is precisely about change. So you can't really have a regional definition of development. And the second point is this list of countries, it's about 50 years old and it's never been updated since. It might have been a little bit useful then, but the world has changed so much in the last half century that it can't possibly be useful now. So we also wanted to see, you see the World Migration Report just looked at 1 year, and we wanted to see what would happen if you look at the trends over time, to join the dots, as it were.
What were the key findings from this study that you would want to share?
There are three things you really have to take account of when you're looking at migration and development. The first thing is you have to take account of population size, because obviously you're going to get many more migrants in a big country than in a small one. The most important thing here is there are 5 times as many people living in the south to start with. So even if there were equal number of migrants in north and south, migrant density, in other words, the percentage in the population, would still be much lower in the south. And another point is the population grows much faster in the south than in the north. So that difference is becoming steadily more important. The second finding was about this question of criteria. If you use the UNDESA criterion, the regional criterion, you get a far higher number of migrants in the south than when you use the World Bank criterion. And the reason for that is because it's such an inaccurate criterion. It includes a lot of countries that have got rich in the meantime, since 1990. Examples are Singapore or Hong Kong, the Gulf oil states. And you have huge numbers of migrants going to these countries, but they don't really belong in the less developed category, at least not economically. Now, we weren't the first people to discover this because the OECD has already pointed that out a couple of years ago. But again, we wanted to look at the trends over time. And what we saw was if you allow for country size and you define South and North in economic terms, you see that migrant density is much lower in the South than the North, at least 9 times lower. The third thing we think you have to do is to distinguish between refugees and other kinds of migrants. About 90% of migration is for economic reasons. The other 10% is forced migration to get away from persecution and violence. And most refugees are moving from south to south. They move usually to a neighboring country just to be safe.
What are the implications of this study for policy or program?
People have been expecting a lot from south to south migration in terms of economic development. For example, they say within Africa there is so much migration that Africans hardly need to come to Europe in order to earn more money. They can remain in the continent. And we found that's absolutely not true. Best way to earn money and send back remittances is to go to a high-income country. You can, for example, go from a low middle-income country to an upper-middle country. It's much more worthwhile to go to a high-income country. That does not mean you have to go to America or Europe. You can go to Hong Kong or Singapore, or there's a long list of countries that used to be called developing countries, but are now very rich and attracting a lot of migrants. That has really changed, but it's simply not true that migration between poorer countries has increased. That's the first implication, I think, that you can't really expect a great deal of economic development from migration between poorer countries. There will always be more coming from south to north. There is one point that's important. We think it's still important to try and increase levels of migration within the global south because it can profit those countries. I mean, both the sending countries and the receiving countries. And what is striking about this south-to-south migration is it's so uneven. It goes down a few well-trodden corridors, and it could be much broader. And we suggest a lot could be done to create new migration corridors, for example, from lower middle countries to upper middle countries, instead of just encouraging people to use existing ones. We think it would be worthwhile for policymakers to try and create new corridors. And one thing that helps is to make regional agreements rather than bilateral agreements between individual countries. Final suggestion was you can, as it were, prime the pump for migration by encouraging new migrants to settle in new destination countries. Because at present, as you know, migrants tend to go where other people have already settled, where there is a diaspora of people from their own country. If you concentrate on setting up a new diaspora, that's the best way to increase migration within the global south.
Now let's listen to Ms. Angelica Neville.
So there's 2 key objectives of this study, which is the community health and mobility in the Pacific study. Today we're talking about specifically the Solomon Islands case study within that broader piece of research. The first objective is to produce up-to-date strategic information relating to the mobility dimensions of community health in Solomon Islands for relevant stakeholders and policymakers. And then there's also a specific objective of the research, which is related to the program it sits within, and that is to inform the development of training materials on gender, mobility and community health, which will also be produced under the CHAMP project.
Can you share with us the study's key findings as well as their implication for policy and program?
We were looking specifically at the gendered impacts with a strong focus on gender-based violence. But the study was framed in broader terms, and when the key informed interviews are conducted, one of the initial questions was just what is the main impact of project-induced migration linked to logging on your community, or framed more generally on communities in Solomon Islands. And of the 68 key informed interviews conducted, 57 respondents highlighted transactional and exploitative sexual relationships relationships as one of the key issues. And I should note that the question was not asking for negative impacts, but was just saying what is the most significant impact, so positive or negative. So that was quite a key finding. It confirmed research that has already been conducted in Solomon Islands around the link between project-induced migration in the context of extractive industries and sexual exploitation. This was really perceived as a key issue by key informants. And related to that, child marriage and sexual exploitation of children was unfortunately raised frequently and seen as a key issue. Another key finding of the study was really significant reluctance to report any issues. So we asked the question relating to a number of different types of gender-based violence, as well as forced marriage and various other examples. It varies between the specific type of gender-based violence that was posed in the question, but generally, if asked, would you report this type of case to the police, or who you would report it to, or what you would do, most respondents said that they would not report, or they wouldn't know how to report. For most types of case, it was around 80% of people saying they would not report or they would not know how to report. And that's a really key finding because it has implications for programming. Awareness raising was seen as something that is useful at the community level. So a number of key informants said that when you undertake awareness raising in the community about crimes related to gender-based violence and how you can report, this does have a noticeable impact following the awareness raising. So that was encouraging, and there was lots of support for more awareness raising at the community level. Another implication was that because there are these issues with reporting, there could be a lot of potential for private sector engagement. So, for example, looking at companies that are working in some of the more vulnerable areas and trying to see what kind of internal mechanisms they could use to prevent these issues occurring in the first place. For example, you could have a code of conduct for extractive industries, but also extending to infrastructure projects, things like that. So that was one of the implications. In terms of the IOM program, based on the findings of the study, we're developing some training materials that will have modules addressing some of the key issues raised from the study. And we're hoping that these will firstly be piloted by IOM in partnership with a local gender-based violence organisation. But we're really hoping that these can be incorporated into the existing awareness raising programs.
Thank you very much, Professor David and Miss Angelica. And thank you all for listening. Please feel free to share your feedback with us. See you on the next podcast.